Amelia stood in the attic of her childhood home, the familiar scent of dust and old wood surrounding her. The house hadn't changed much, but something felt different. It wasn't just the years that had passed. It was the unspoken tension in the air since she'd arrived 2 days ago. Her mother, Carla, had been warm yet distant, and her father, Mark, was quieter than ever. The attic was cluttered with boxes from their past. Amelia pulled a dusty box toward her, filled with old family photos and memorabilia. As she flipped through them, a familiar face caught her eye. There was Luke, her brother, smiling at the camera. She paused, her fingers lingering over the photograph, feeling a pang of sadness. He had vanished when she was only 10. The memory of his disappearance was a shadow that followed her everywhere, yet her parents rarely spoke of him. At the bottom of the box, something unexpected caught her attention. It was an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline was barely legible, but the name Luke jumped out at her. Her heart raced as she skimmed through the article. It mentioned an incident, a tragedy that had occurred shortly before Luke disappeared. How had she never seen this before? Her mind buzzed with questions. Why hadn't her parents ever mentioned this? Why had they kept it hidden? Without thinking, she rushed downstairs, the clipping in her hand. "Mom," Amelia called, her voice sharper than she intended. She found Carla in the kitchen, quietly preparing dinner. "What is this?" Amelia demanded, holding up the paper. Carla's eyes widened slightly before narrowing in suspicion. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice calm but strained. "In the attic." "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Carla wiped her hands on a towel, her movements deliberate and slow. "There's nothing to tell, Amelia. It's from so long ago." Amelia shook her head, her frustration building. "But it mentions Luke. You never told me there was an incident before he disappeared." Carla's face darkened. "It's better if you forget about it. Luke is gone, and dredging up the past won't bring him back." Amelia felt a cold chill run down her spine. There was something more here, something her mother wasn't telling her. But before she could press further, her father entered the room. "Amelia," Mark said, his voice low and measured. "Leave it alone." She looked between her parents, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Something was being kept from her, and she wasn't about to let it go. The following morning, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She wandered through the small town she had grown up in, hoping to clear her mind, but her thoughts kept circling back to the clipping. Her parents had never been forthcoming about Luke's disappearance, but now it seemed they had been actively hiding something. Amelia couldn't help but wonder if others in town knew more than she did. She decided to visit Tom, a family friend who had known Luke well before he disappeared. Tom's house was just as she remembered, modest, with a well-kept garden. We opened the door, his face lit up in recognition. "Amelia, it's been years. How are you?" "I'm good," she lied, forcing a smile. "I was hoping to ask you about Luke." Tom's face fell slightly, and his eyes shifted to the ground. "Luva, that was a long time ago. I know, but I found something in the attic. A newspaper clipping about an incident before he disappeared. Do you remember anything about that?" Tom hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't think it's a good idea to dig into that, Amelia. What's past is past." Her heart sank. It was the same response she had gotten from her parents: avoidance, reluctance. "Why didn't anyone want to talk about Luke?" "Please," she pressed. "I just want to understand what happened." Tom sighed heavily and stepped back, motioning for her to come inside. "I'll tell you what I remember, but I don't think it'll give you the answers you're looking for." They sat at the kitchen table, the sunlight filtering through the window. "There was an accident," Tom began, his voice low. "Luke was mixed up in something. The details are fuzzy, but it wasn't good. Your parents wanted to protect him. That's why they kept quiet." Amelia's stomach turned. Protect him from what? She had always believed that Luke had run away, but now it seemed there was more to the story. Something her parents had hidden not just from her, but from everyone. "What kind of accident?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know everything," Tom said, his tone growing more guarded. "But it wasn't just an accident, Amelia. It was something much bigger. And your parents, well, they weren't innocent either. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Her parents. What could they possibly have been involved in that was so terrible they felt the need to keep it a secret for so long? Tom, I need to know. Stop asking questions, he interrupted, his eyes suddenly filled with fear. For your sake, just leave it alone. Amelia couldn't shake the weight of Tom's warning. His cryptic words haunted her as she walked home, her mind racing with questions. What were her parents hiding? And how were they involved in Luke's disappearance? The more she thought about it, the more determined she became to find the truth. By the time she reached the house, the evening sun was casting long shadows across the yard. She found her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee. It wasn't unusual for Mark to be quiet, but there was something different about his demeanor tonight, an air of tension that made the room feel colder. "Dad, we need to talk," Amelia said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Mark didn't look up. "About what?" She took a deep breath and sat across from him, placing the newspaper clipping on the table between them. "About this, and about Luke." Mark's eyes flickered to the article for a split second before he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I told you to leave it alone." "Why?" Amelia asked, her frustration boiling over. "Why does everyone keep telling me that? There's obviously something you're not telling me. What happened to Luke?" Mark's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Amelia thought he might refuse to answer. But then, in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "You think you want to know the truth, but you don't. Some things are better left buried." Amelia's hands tightened into fists. "I deserve to know what happened to my brother. He wasn't the person you think he was," Mark muttered, his eyes hardening. "Luke got involved with the wrong people, made some bad choices. We tried to help him, but it was too late." Amelia's heart raced as her father's words sank in. "What do you mean, too late? What did he do?" Mark didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the coffee cup in front of him, as if he were reliving some painful memory. "There was an accident," he finally said. "Luke was part of it. A boy died. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And after that, he was never the same." Amelia felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "A boy died. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think he just ran away?" "Because it was easier," Mark said, his voice raw. "It was easier to believe he ran away than to face the truth. Your mother and I, we thought it was the best way to protect you." Amelia's mind spun, trying to process everything her father had just revealed. Her brother, a murderer. It didn't seem possible. But as much as she wanted to deny it, she couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth in her father's eyes. "I need to know more," she said, her voice trembling. "Who was the boy? What happened?" But before Mark could answer, Carla entered the room, her face pale and drawn. "That's enough," she said sharply. "We've kept this secret for years, and it's not going to do any good to dredge it up now." Amelia stood, her body trembling with anger. "So that's it? You're just going to pretend like nothing happened? Like Luke's disappearance didn't destroy this family?" Carla's eyes filled with tears. "We did what we had to do to survive." The house felt like a prison. Every corner of it held secrets, and Amelia was suffocating under their weight. After the argument with her parents, she needed to get out, clear her head, and figure out what to do next. She grabbed her jacket and left without a word, walking aimlessly through the darkened streets of her childhood town. The town hadn't changed much. The same old shops, the same small clusters of houses. Everything felt frozen in time, as if the years since Luke's disappearance had passed in slow motion. As she wandered through the quiet streets, Amelia found herself drawn to the local library, where the town's records were kept. If her parents wouldn't tell her the full story, maybe she could find it for herself. The library was dimly lit, with only a few patrons scattered among the stacks. Amelia made her way to the archives, where she began searching through the old newspapers and records. The articles she found about the accident were vague, but they confirmed what her father had told her. A boy named Samuel had died under suspicious circumstances, and Luke had been questioned but never formally charged. The case had been closed without resolution. Amelia sat back in her chair, staring at the yellowed pages in front of her. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still so many gaps. Who were the wrong people Luke had gotten involved with? And why had her parents been so determined to bury the truth? As she left the library, Amelia noticed something strange. A group of older men were sitting outside the local diner, talking in hushed tones. When they saw her, their conversation abruptly stopped, and they stared at her with something between suspicion and fear. It was as if her presence reminded them of something they'd rather forget. Curious, Amelia approached the diner and took a seat at one of the outdoor tables. She ordered a coffee and kept her ears open, hoping to overhear more of the conversation. The men whispered among themselves, glancing at her every so often. She couldn't make out much of what they were saying, but she caught enough to know that they were talking about Luke. And it wasn't in a friendly way. Her curiosity got the better of her. "Excuse me," she said, leaning toward the group. "You mentioned my brother, Luke. What do you know about him?" The men exchanged nervous glances. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, finally spoke. "You're Amelia, right? Luke's sisters." She nodded. "I need to know what happened. My parents won't tell me the full story." The man hesitated, then leaned closer. "Your brother. He was a good kid, but he got mixed up with some bad folks. People in this town don't like to talk about it, but there was more going on than just that accident. Luke was involved in something bigger, and after Samuel died, things went downhill fast. People were scared, still are." Amelia's heart pounded. Scared of what? The man glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. It wasn't just Luke. There were others. They're still around, and they don't take kindly to people digging up the past. Amelia swallowed hard. "Who are they?" The man shook his head. "You're better off not knowing. For your own sake, Amelia, leave it alone." But Amelia knew she couldn't walk away. She was in too deep now. Whatever her brother had been involved in, it was still affecting the town and possibly putting her in danger. She had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning, Amelia woke up with a heavy weight on her chest. Her dreams had been filled with fragmented images. Her brother's face, the newspaper clippings, the conversations she had overheard. Despite everything her parents and the townspeople had warned her, she couldn't let it go. There was still something missing from the puzzle, something that tied everything together. She had to find it. Determined to search deeper into her family's past, Amelia returned to the attic, combing through old boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Her hands grazed over faded photographs and forgotten mementos, but nothing stood out, until she came across a small, tightly folded envelope at the bottom of an old wooden chest. The envelope was yellowed with age, and as she carefully opened it, Amelia's pulse quickened. It was a letter, written in her brother Luke's handwriting. She recognized the messy scrawl instantly. The date on the letter was from shortly before his disappearance. As her eyes scanned the page, her stomach churned with each new word. "Mom, Dad, I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The things they're asking me to do, it's too much. I didn't sign up for this. I know I messed up with Samuel, but I didn't mean for things to get out of control. I thought we could get away with it, but now they won't let me go. I'm scared. I don't know who to trust anymore. I don't want to drag you down with me, but I don't see another way out. I'm sorry for everything." The letter ended abruptly, as if Luke had written it in a rush. Amelia's hands trembled as she held the fragile paper. Her brother hadn't just run away. He had been in serious trouble, and it seemed whatever he had been involved in was far more dangerous than she had imagined. She hurried downstairs, the letter clutched in her hand. Carla was in the living room, staring blankly out the window, lost in her own thoughts. Without a word, Amelia placed the letter on the coffee table in front of her. Her mother's eyes flickered to the letter, and the color drained from her face. She didn't need to read it to know what it was. Slowly, she reached out and picked it up, her fingers trembling. "I found it in the attic," Amelia said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Carla's voice was barely a whisper. "I thought I had destroyed it. After Luke disappeared, I didn't want anyone to find it. So it's true." Amelia pressed. "Luke was involved in something dangerous, and you and Dad covered it up." Carla closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. We thought we were protecting him. He was so scared, Amelia. He didn't know what to do, and neither did we. We didn't want to lose him, but in the end, we lost him anyway. Amelia's heart ached as she watched her mother break down. For so long, she had resented her parents for their silence, but now she saw the guilt that had eaten away at them for years. Still, there were so many unanswered questions. What happened after he wrote this? Amelia asked softly. Did he come to you? Did you try to help him? Carla shook her head, wiping away her tears. He never gave us the letter. We found it in his room after he disappeared. By then, it was too late. Whatever he had gotten himself into, it was too dangerous for us to stop. Amelia sat down beside her mother, her mind racing. Who were these people, Mom? What were they making him do? Carla hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. We don't know exactly who they were, but they were powerful. Luke said they were involved in things, illegal things. We didn't ask questions, but we knew enough to be afraid. Armed with the new information from the letter, Amelia felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. The accident involving Samuel, Luke's involvement with dangerous people, and the fear her parents had lived with for years, it all led to something bigger. But the truth still felt just out of reach. Determined to find out more, Amelia revisited the abandoned house on the outskirts of town, the same house that had been mentioned in Luke's letter. It was a place she remembered vaguely from her childhood, a dilapidated, decaying building hidden behind overgrown trees. Luke had often disappeared to this house, but at the time, she hadn't questioned why. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rotting leaves as she approached the house, her heart racing in her chest. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and as she stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath her feet. The house was eerily quiet, but there were signs that it had once been a gathering place. Old beer bottles and cigarette butts littered the floor, and graffiti was scrawled across the walls. But it wasn't just any graffiti. There were strange symbols, cryptic markings that sent a chill down Amelia's spine. She had no idea what they meant, but they seemed to be a part of whatever Luke had been involved in. As she wandered through the empty rooms, her mind kept returning to the letter. They won't let me go, Luke had written. Who were they? What had they forced him to do? And why had the town been so willing to turn a blind eye? In one of the back rooms, Amelia found more remnants of Luke's life. There were old clothes, a torn-up sleeping bag, and even a few books that looked like they had been left behind in a hurry. She knelt down and picked up one of the books, flipping through its pages. To her surprise, a small folded note fell out. It was another letter, but this one wasn't from Luke. It was addressed to him. Luke, you know what you have to do. There's no turning back now. We've kept you safe this long, but if you make another mistake, we won't be able to protect you anymore. Do what we asked, and don't involve anyone else. This is your last chance. Amelia's hands shook as she read the note. It was a warning, one that Luke had clearly ignored. Whoever these people were, they had controlled him, threatened him, and ultimately driven him away. But the worst part was the realization that Luke had been too afraid to reach out for help, even when it had become clear that he was in over his head. As Amelia stood in the middle of that abandoned house, surrounded by the ghosts of her brother's past, she felt a rising sense of urgency. The truth was close, closer than it had ever been. But with it came a growing danger, one that Luke had tried to warn her about from beyond the grave. She needed to find out who these people were before they found her. Amelia returned home from the abandoned house, her mind racing with what she had uncovered. She clutched the second letter tightly in her hand, knowing that it was the key to unraveling the rest of the mystery. But before she could decide her next step, she needed answers from her father. Her mother had given her fragments of the truth, but Mark had been holding back more than anyone. As she entered the house, she found Mark sitting in his usual spot at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window. He didn't look up as she approached. "I went to the old house," Amelia said, dropping the letter on the table in front of him. Mark's eyes flicked toward the letter for a split second, and his face paled. He picked it up, and his hands trembled as he unfolded the note. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you find this?" In the house Luke used to go to, Amelia said, crossing her arms. There were things of his there. Things you never told me about. Mark didn't respond at first. He stared down at the letter, as if hoping that if he stared long enough, it would disappear. But it didn't. Amelia could see the battle in his eyes, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. You knew, didn't you? Amelia pressed. You knew what Luke was involved in, and you covered it up. Why? Mark sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her accusation. We didn't have a choice, Amelia. We were trying to protect him. Protect him from what? She demanded, her voice rising. From these people. From the truth. Mark slammed his hand down on the table, making Amelia flinch. You don't understand. Those people, they weren't just some local thugs. They had connections, real connections. If we had gone to the police, Luke wouldn't have been the only one they came after. Amelia's heart raced. She could see the fear in her father's eyes, fear that hadn't faded even after all these years. So, you just let him run away. You let them take him. Mark shook his head. We didn't let them take him. He made his own choice. He got in over his head, and by the time we realized how deep he was, it was too late. They had leverage on him, and there was nothing we could do to get him out. Amelia swallowed the lump in her throat, her emotions a storm inside her. And Samuel, what really happened to him? Her father's face darkened. Samuel was an accident. Luke, he never meant for that to happen. But once it did, there was no going back. The people Luke was involved with made sure of that. They threatened to expose him, to use Samuel's death against him if he didn't do what they asked. Tears filled Amelia's eyes as the full weight of the situation hit her. Her brother had been trapped, blackmailed, and forced into a life he never wanted. And her parents had lived with that guilt for years, unable to stop what had already been set in motion. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Why did you let me believe he just ran away? We thought we were protecting you, Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. You were so young. We didn't want you to carry the burden of knowing what he'd done. Amelia wiped away the tears that spilled down her cheeks. But I needed to know. I deserved to know. Mark reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The betrayal was too deep, the lies too damaging. She couldn't look at him without feeling the sting of their silence. Amelia, we did what we thought was best, Mark said, his voice pleading. But we never stopped looking for him. We thought maybe one day he'd come back, but he never did. Amelia stood, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Maybe he didn't come back because he knew there was no way out. Mark didn't respond. He simply lowered his head, and in that moment, Amelia realized how broken her father truly was. The weight of her father's confession hung heavy in the air, but Amelia couldn't let herself be consumed by it. There was too much at stake now. With each piece of the puzzle she uncovered, she felt closer to the truth about what had really happened to her brother. But that truth came with a price, one that was threatening to tear her family apart. After a conversation with her father, Amelia left the house, needing space to think. The streets of her small town, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze of lies and deceit. Every face she passed seemed to hold secrets, every glance a reminder that the people around her knew more than they let on. She found herself walking aimlessly, her mind racing with questions. Why hadn't anyone come forward about what Luke had been involved in? Why had the town been so willing to look the other way? The sun was setting by the time Amelia reached the outskirts of town, where the old abandoned factory loomed in the distance. It had been closed for years, ever since a fire had gutted most of the building. But something about the place drew her in. Maybe it was the isolation, or the fact that it was a place her brother had once been rumored to frequent. Whatever it was, Amelia felt a pull to explore it. As she approached the rusted gates, she noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone had been here recently. Her heart quickened as she ducked under the gate and made her way inside. The factory was eerily silent. The smell of charred was still lingering in the air despite the years that had passed since the fire. Amelia's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as she wandered deeper into the building. She had no idea what she was looking for, but a part of her hoped she might find something that would give her the answer she needed. And then she saw it. A makeshift campsite, hidden in the shadows of one of the old rooms. There were empty food cans, a tattered blanket, and a half-burned candle. Someone had been living here, recently. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. Could it be Luke? Was her brother still alive, hiding in plain sight all these years? Just as she was about to investigate further, a noise behind her made her freeze. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from the hallway. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound, her pulse racing. She wasn't alone. A figure stepped into the doorway, shrouded in darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved, both frozen in place by the unexpected encounter. And then the figure spoke, their voice low and unfamiliar. "You shouldn't have come here." Amelia's heart pounded in her ears as the stranger stepped closer, revealing a face she didn't recognize. It wasn't Luke, but whoever this person was, they clearly didn't want her there. "I'm looking for my brother," Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you know him, Luke?" The stranger's expression darkened. "You need to leave, now. This is bigger than you can understand." Amelia stood her ground, her fear slowly giving way to anger. "I'm not going anywhere until I find out what happened to Luke." The stranger sighed, their eyes narrowing. "You're just like him, stubborn. But he paid the price for his mistakes, and if you keep digging, you'll end up paying it too." Amelia's blood ran cold. Whoever this person was, they knew her brother. They knew what had happened to him. But before she could ask more, the stranger turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone in the empty factory. The encounter at the abandoned factory haunted Amelia for days. The stranger's words echoed in her mind. "You're just like him, stubborn. But he paid the price for his mistakes, and if you keep digging, you'll end up paying it too." Whoever this person was, they knew Luke, and they knew what had happened to him. But the danger in their warning was clear. Amelia was treading on dangerous ground, and the closer she got to the truth, the more perilous her situation became. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Amelia couldn't stop. Her brother's life, his fate, had been wrapped in lies and half-truths for too long. She needed answers. She decided to reach out to the one person who might know more than he had let on. Tom, the family friend who had warned her to leave things alone. If anyone had more insight into what Luke had been involved in, it was him. She found Tom at his house, tending to his garden in the late afternoon light. His face tensed when he saw her approach, but he greeted her nonetheless. "Amelia," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I thought you'd be gone by now." "I can't leave, not yet," she replied, her voice steady. "I found something, a letter, and I met someone who knows about Luke. I need you to tell me everything, Tom, please." Tom's eyes darkened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "I told you before, this isn't something you should be digging into. It's dangerous." "I don't care," Amelia said, frustration building inside her. "I need to know the truth." Tom studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right," he said, gesturing for her to sit with him on the porch. "But you're not going to like what I have to say." Amelia braced herself as Tom began to speak. "Luke was a good kid," he started, his voice soft. "But he got caught up in something way over his head. There were people in this town, people with money, power, and connections. They controlled everything from the shadows. Drugs, illegal deals, you name it. And they recruited kids like Luke to do their dirty work." Amelia's stomach churned as Tom continued. "Luke got involved with them because he needed money. He was young, thought he could handle it. But then the accident happened. Samuel's death wasn't supposed to happen, and it put a target on Luke's back. The people he was working for, let's just say they don't like loose ends. They forced him into deeper deals, told him he had to prove his loyalty to them." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. "And my parents, they knew." Tom nodded. "They knew some of it, not all. Your father tried to get Luke out, but once those people have you, they don't let go. Your parents covered for Luke, tried to keep him safe. But after a while, he had no choice but to run." Amelia's throat tightened. So Luke didn't just disappear. He was running for his life. Tom sighed. Yes, and he wasn't alone. There were others like him, but they're gone now. Either they left, or, well, let's just say they didn't make it. A cold chill ran down Amelia's spine. And these people, the ones who controlled Luke, are they still here? Still in the town? Tom hesitated before nodding grimly. Some of them, yes, but they're not the kind of people you want to cross. If they know you're asking questions, they'll come after you, just like they came after Luke. Amelia's hands clenched into fists. I don't care. I'm not backing down. Tom's face softened, a mix of fear and admiration in his eyes. You're brave, Amelia, but be careful. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous it gets. And if those people find out you're still looking for Luke, they'll make sure you disappear too. The sun was setting when Amelia returned home, Tom's warnings still ringing in her ears. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but there was still so much she didn't know. Her brother had been trapped in a web of crime, controlled by powerful people in their small town, and her parents had been complicit in covering it up. But there was one last piece of the story that Amelia needed to hear from her mother. Carla was sitting in the living room when Amelia entered, her eyes red from crying. It seemed like all the years of guilt and silence were finally catching up with her. Amelia sat down across from her, her heart heavy with the burden of what she had learned. "Mom," she began, her voice soft. "I talked to Tom. He told me about Luke, about the people who were controlling him." Carla's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes. "I was hoping you wouldn't have to hear all of that," she whispered. "I didn't want you to carry the weight of it." Amelia shook her head. "But I needed to know. You and Dad have been keeping this secret for so long. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Carla's eyes filled with tears again. "We thought we were protecting you. After Luke disappeared, we didn't know what else to do. We couldn't go to the police. Those people had connections everywhere. If we had told the truth, we would have put you and the rest of the family in danger." Amelia's chest tightened. "But you let me believe he just ran away. We thought it would be easier," Carla said, her voice breaking. "We thought if we kept the truth from you, you could move on. But we were wrong. You deserve to know. And I'm so sorry, Amelia. I'm so sorry for all the lies." Amelia's heart ached as she watched her mother break down. For so long, she had been angry with her parents. But now, seeing the pain in her mother's eyes, she understood the impossible choices they had faced. They had been trying to protect her, even if it had meant living with the guilt of Luke's disappearance for years. "What happened to Luke after he left?" Amelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carla wiped her eyes again and took a deep breath. "We don't know for sure. We've heard rumors over the years. Some people said he went south. Others said he joined a group that moves around the country. But we never found him. And we've been living with the fear that those people, that they might have caught up to him." Amelia's hands clenched into fists. "Do you think he's still alive?" Carla looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. "I want to believe he is. But after all this time, I don't know." The weight of her mother's words sank into Amelia like a stone. Luke's fate was still a mystery, but now she understood just how dangerous the truth was. Her brother had been forced into a life he didn't choose, and her family had been caught in the crossfire. But there was still one thing Amelia couldn't let go of. The note she had found at the factory, the warning that had been left behind. Whoever had written it knew more than they were letting on. And if Luke was still alive, Amelia was determined to find him. "I'm going to keep looking," she said quietly. "I can't let this go, Mom. I need to know what happened to Luke." Carla's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, she didn't try to stop her. "I know," she whispered. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Amelia nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know where this search would lead her, but one thing was clear. She wasn't done yet. The truth was out there, and she was willing to risk everything to find it. The days following her mother's confession felt like a whirlwind for Amelia. She couldn't stop thinking about Luke, about the life he had been forced into and the people who had trapped him. More than anything, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting closer to the truth. But with every step forward, the danger grew. The warnings from Tom and the stranger in the factory echoed in her mind, but they only fueled her determination. Amelia knew she had to confront her father one last time. There was more he hadn't told her, more secrets that had been buried beneath his stoic demeanor. That evening, she found Mark in the garage, working on some small repair. He didn't look up as she entered, his hands busy, but there was a tension in his posture that told Amelia he knew what was coming. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. "I know there's more. You haven't told me everything." Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He set down his tools but didn't turn to face her. "What else do you want to know, Amelia? Haven't we put you through enough already?" Amelia clenched her fists, frustration bubbling up inside her. "I want to know the whole truth, Dad. You've been protecting me, protecting Luke's memory, but it's time to stop. I deserve to know everything." Mark finally turned, his face drawn and weary. He looked older than she remembered, as though the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. "You think knowing the truth will make it better? It won't, Amelia. It'll just hurt more." "I don't care," she said, stepping closer. "I can handle it." For a long moment, Mark said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. "After the accident with Samuel, Luke didn't just disappear. He came to me. He told me everything. He was terrified, Amelia. He thought they were going to kill him." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "Who?" "The people he was working for." Mark nodded. "They were powerful, dangerous. They had connections in law enforcement, in government. They owned this town in ways you wouldn't believe. Luke got in too deep, and once Samuel died, they used it against him. They told him if he didn't do what they asked, they'd expose him. They'd make sure he took the fall for everything." Amelia's heart raced. "And what did you do?" Mark's face twisted in pain. "I tried to help him. I went to them, begged them to let him go. I offered them money, anything I could, but they didn't want money. They wanted control. They told me there was only one way out, for Luke to do one final job for them. After that, they said they'd let him disappear, help him start over." Tears filled Amelia's eyes as the reality of her father's words hit her. "And he did it, didn't he? He did what they asked?" Mark nodded, his voice breaking. "He didn't have a choice. He did the job, and then he ran. We helped him disappear, gave him money, contacts. But we never heard from him again. We don't know if they found him, or if he managed to stay hidden. All we know is that he never came back." Amelia's chest tightened, the grief and anger mixing inside her. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me help?" Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "You were just a kid, Amelia. We didn't want to drag you into it. We thought we were protecting you. But I guess we were just protecting ourselves." The silence between them was heavy, the weight of the years pressing down on them both. Amelia could see the pain etched into her father's face, the guilt that had eaten away at him for so long. He had tried to protect his family, but in the end, the lies had torn them apart. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "I failed you. I failed Luke. I thought I could fix it, but I was wrong." Amelia swallowed hard, her heart aching for the father she had lost to the lies. "We can't change the past," she said softly. "But we can't keep living like this, either. We need to move forward, together." Mark nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I know." The next morning, Amelia woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The truth was out. Her parents had finally told her everything they knew about Luke's disappearance and the dangerous people who had controlled his life. But now that she had the full picture, she realized that her journey was far from over. There were still unanswered questions, questions that only the people behind Luke's downfall could answer. Amelia knew what she had to do, but the decision weighed heavily on her. Going after these people, exposing the secret that had kept her brother hidden for so long, meant putting herself in danger. But she couldn't let fear hold her back. She had come too far to stop now. She spent the day gathering everything she had: Luke's letters, the newspaper clippings, the information Tom had given her. It was time to confront the truth head-on, no matter the cost. Her first stop was the diner where she had overheard the old men talking about Luke. She had a feeling that one of them, a man named Roy, knew more than he had let on. When she entered the diner, The group of men fell silent, their eyes tracking her movements. She approached Roy's table, her heart pounding in her chest. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady. "About Luke." Roy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around at the other men before nodding. "Not here," he muttered. "Meet me out back in 10 minutes." Amelia nodded and left the diner, waiting in the alley behind the building. The minutes ticked by slowly, her pulse racing with anticipation. When Roy finally appeared, his face was set in a grim expression. "I don't know what you think you're doing, girl," he said, his voice low, "but you're playing a dangerous game." "I just want the truth," Amelia replied. "What happened to Luke? What do you know?" Roy hesitated before lighting a cigarette, the smoke curling in the air between them. "Your brother was in deep," he said finally. "He got involved with people who don't take kindly to loose ends. After the accident with Samuel, they tightened the noose around him, made him do things he didn't want to do." Amelia swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "I know that, but where is he now? Is he still alive?" Roy took a long drag on his cigarette before exhaling slowly. "I don't know for sure. Last I heard, he was still running, but that was years ago. Those people don't forget, though. If he's still alive, he's not safe. And neither are you, if you keep digging." Amelia's heart sank. The chances of finding Luke were slim, but she couldn't stop now. "I have to know," she said, her voice breaking. "He's my brother." Roy sighed and stubbed out his cigarette. "I get it, but listen to me. You're dealing with dangerous people. They run this town, have their hands in everything. If they think you're a threat, they'll come after you, just like they did with Luke." Amelia's stomach twisted with fear, but she stood her ground. "I don't care. I need to find him. I need to know the truth." Roy shook his head, his expression softening slightly. "You're just like your brother, stubborn as hell. But be careful, kid. If you're not, you might end up paying the price he did." Amelia nodded, her resolve hardening. She was scared, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth was out there, and she was willing to risk everything to find it, even if it meant confronting the people who had destroyed her family. Amelia left the diner with Roy's warning heavy on her mind. She knew that finding Luke meant putting herself in danger, but there was no turning back now. The truth was so close she could feel it, yet every step forward seemed to reveal how far-reaching and dangerous the forces against her were. But no matter how hard the path became, she had to keep going. Luke's fate and her own peace of mind depended on it. The town felt different to her now. What once seemed like a sleepy, close-knit community was now exposed as something darker, with unseen players controlling the lives of the people within it. Everyone knew more than they let on, and the sense of isolation that came with being on the outside of these secrets weighed heavily on Amelia. Returning home, she found her parents in the living room. Her mother's eyes were still puffy from crying, and her father sat stiffly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. It had been days since the full truth had come out, but the tension in the air remained thick. Amelia stood in the doorway, unsure of how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. "We need to talk," Amelia said, breaking the silence. Her parents exchanged a glance before Carla nodded. "We know, Amelia." Amelia walked further into the room, standing before them with the weight of her decision pressing down on her. "I'm going to find him," she said firmly, "no matter what it takes." Her father looked down, his expression unreadable. Carla shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her eyes again. "Amelia, please. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Amelia replied, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her heart. "Luke is out there somewhere. I can't leave him alone, wondering if he's still running, still afraid. You've both carried this burden for so long, but now it's mine. I have to find out the truth." Mark finally spoke, his voice gruff and filled with regret. "We try to find him too, you know. We look for him, but those people, they don't let go. They'll come after you if they think you're getting too close." Amelia squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid. Not anymore." Her father shook his head slowly, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes. You're brave. Just like him. Amelia's heart clenched at the mention of Luke. I have to do this, Dad. Mark sighed, finally meeting her gaze. Then be careful. And if you find him, tell him we never stopped loving him. Amelia nodded, her heart heavy with emotion. I will. Amelia left her parents' house with a sense of finality. This was it, the moment she would set out to find Luke, no matter the consequences. She knew the journey ahead would be dangerous, but there was no turning back now. Her mind was set, and her heart was full of hope, no matter how slim the chances of finding her brother were. She spent the next few days preparing for her search. She pored over maps, read old articles about Luke's disappearance, and compiled everything she had learned from Tom, Roy, and her parents. The trail was cold, and she had no clear starting point, but Amelia trusted her instincts. Something, maybe the letter, maybe the warning from the stranger at the factory, kept pulling her toward the outskirts of town, to the abandoned places where Luke had once hidden. On the day she set out, the sky was gray, and the air carried the scent of rain. Amelia packed lightly, bringing only the essentials. Her parents watched her leave from the porch, their faces etched with worry, but they didn't try to stop her. They knew, just as she did, that this was something she had to do alone. Her first stop was the old factory, where she had encountered the stranger. She searched the grounds again, looking for any sign that someone had been there recently. The factory felt eerily still, as if it held its breath, waiting for something to happen. There was no sign of a stranger this time, but Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She found more clues hidden in the wreckage, small things that suggested people had been here, living in the shadows. A few discarded personal items, the remnants of a small fire, but nothing that pointed directly to Luke. Frustrated, but not deterred, Amelia pressed on, visiting the outskirts of town where she knew Luke had once hung out. Each step felt like she was walking deeper into the unknown, but her resolve never wavered. It was an old roadside diner on the edge of a neighboring town where she finally found something that made her heart stop. The diner was quiet, with only a few locals scattered around, but as Amelia scanned the room, her eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold. Tucked into the corner, barely noticeable among the faded decor, was a symbol she recognized. It was the same symbol she had seen scrawled on the walls of the abandoned house Luke had frequented, the same cryptic marking that had haunted her since the beginning of this journey. Whoever had drawn it had been here recently. Amelia approached the diner's old cashier, an elderly woman with kind eyes. "Excuse me," Amelia said, her voice steady. "Do you know who drew that?" The woman glanced at the symbol, her face hardening. "I don't ask questions I don't want answers to," she said quietly. Amelia's heart raced. She was close, closer than ever. "Please," she pressed. "I'm looking for someone. My brother. He was involved with people who use that symbol. Have you seen him?" The woman hesitated, her eyes softening. "A lot of people come through here, dear, but if you're looking for answers, you should talk to the man in the back booth. He doesn't say much, but he knows more than he lets on." Amelia's pulse quickened as she glanced toward the back of the diner. Sitting alone, sipping a cup of coffee, was a man in his 40s with a scruffy beard and a weathered look. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she could feel the weight of his presence, as if he knew more than anyone in this quiet, forgotten place. Taking a deep breath, Amelia made her way over to him, her hands trembling. This was it, her last chance to find Luke. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the man in the back booth. Every instinct told her that he was the key to finding out what had happened to Luke. She took a deep breath and sat down across from him, trying to steady her nerves. The man barely glanced at her, continuing to sip his coffee as if he hadn't noticed her presence at all. "I'm looking for my brother," Amelia said, her voice low but firm. "Luke." The man didn't respond right away. He set down his cup and finally looked up at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "This is dangerous ground you're walking on." "I don't care," Amelia replied, her voice trembling with the weight of her determination. "I need to know what happened to him." The man sighed and leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Your brother made his choice a long time ago. He got involved with the wrong people, and he paid the price. Amelia's stomach twisted. Is he alive? The man hesitated, his gaze hardening. That depends on what you mean by alive. If you're asking if he's still breathing, then yes. But the man you knew as your brother is long gone. He's a ghost now, living on borrowed time. The people he crossed, they don't let go easily. Tears pricked at Amelia's eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. Where is he? The man shook his head. Even if I told you, it wouldn't matter. Finding him won't fix what's broken. He's been on the run for years, hiding in places you can't even imagine. He's done things you don't want to know about. Amelia's heart ached at the thought of Luke living like that, a shadow of the person he once was. But she couldn't give up. Not now. I need to find him. Please. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. You're brave. I'll give you that. But you're also stubborn, just like your brother. He used to talk about you, you know? Said you were the only good thing in his life. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Then help me. If he's still alive, he deserves to know that his family hasn't forgotten him. The man sighed again, rubbing his hands over his face. Fine, he said after a long pause. But I'm warning you, once you go down this path, there's no turning back. You'll be putting yourself in danger, just like he did. I don't care, Amelia said. I'm not afraid. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, scribbling something on it before sliding it across the table to her. This is where he was last seen. It's a safe house, but don't expect a warm welcome. If he's there, he's not the same person you remember. Amelia took the paper, her hands trembling as she read the address. It was in a remote location, far from town, a place she had never been before. Her heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. Thank you, she whispered, standing up to leave. The man gave her a somber nod. Good luck, kid. You're going to need it. The drive to the remote safe house felt like an eternity. The road was long and winding, cutting through dense forests and deserted landscapes. The closer Amelia got, the more her heart raced. She didn't know what to expect, whether Luke would even be there, or what state he would be in if he was. But she couldn't turn back now. The safe house was a small, run-down cabin, hidden deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and peeling paint, but something about it told Amelia that this was the place. Her pulse quickened as she approached the front door, her hands shaking. She knocked, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. For a long moment, there was no response. Amelia's heart sank, fear gnawing at her. What if she was too late? What if Luke was gone, forever lost to the darkness that had consumed his life? But then, the door creaked open just a crack. A shadowed figure stood in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make out the face of the person standing before her. Luke, she whispered, her voice trembling with hope and fear. There was a long pause, and then the figure stepped into the light. It was him, her brother, older, thinner, and worn by years of running, but unmistakably Luke. His eyes, once so full of life, were now haunted, as if he had seen too much, lost too much. But despite everything, it was still him. Amelia, Luke said softly, his voice rough with emotion. What are you doing here? Tears streamed down her face as she stepped closer. I came to find you. I couldn't let you disappear without knowing what happened to you. Luke's expression softened, and for a moment, the years seemed to melt away. You shouldn't have come, he said, his voice filled with regret. It's not safe here. It's not safe for you. I don't care, Amelia replied, her voice shaking. I don't care about the danger. I just needed to see you, to know you're okay. Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not okay, Amelia. I haven't been okay in a long time. I don't care, she repeated, stepping closer and taking his hand. You're still my brother, and we can figure this out together. Luke's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Amelia saw a glimpse of the brother she had lost. He squeezed her hand. A fragile connection formed between them after all this time. "I don't deserve your help," Luke whispered. "Not after everything I've done. You deserve a chance," Amelia said softly. "We all make mistakes, but you're still part of this family. We've never stopped loving you." Luke closed his eyes, as if he couldn't bear the weight of her words. "I don't know if I can ever go back," he said. "The people I worked for, they won't just let me walk away. We'll figure out," Amelia promised. "I'm not leaving you behind, Luke. Not again." For the first time in years, Luke smiled. A small, sad smile, but a smile nonetheless. He nodded slowly, the walls he had built around himself starting to crumble. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go home." As they walked back to the car, the forest around them seemed less ominous, less dark. For the first time in a long time, Amelia felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be challenges, dangers, and unresolved threats. But for now, she had her brother back. And that was enough. Hey, everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to show your support. Your engagement helps us create more content just like this. What moment in the story impacted you the most? Was it the emotional family reunion, the dark secrets revealed, or the thrilling confrontation with danger? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, we want to hear from you. Drop your suggestions for the next story you'd like to see on this channel. Whether it's a mystery, a heart-wrenching drama, or a supernatural twist, your ideas are always welcome. Thanks for being part of this amazing journey, and stay tuned for more exciting stories.